Hello friends. In this section we are going to have discussion of the anatomy of fourth ventricle. It has been a while since we uploaded the last video, but now we'll maintain consistency in uploading videos. So let us start the discussion of the anatomy of fourth ventricle. So the different parameters that we have to study in this, these are the floor of the fourth ventricle, boundaries of fourth ventricle, angles of fourth ventricle, recesses of fourth ventricle, the connections of fourth ventricle with other ventricles, and the roof of fourth ventricle, as well as the Tela Choroidae and the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. So these are various parameters that we have to discuss. So let us start with a basic diagram in order to get an idea about fourth ventricle. This is midbrain, pons, and the medulla. As we can understand, this is the diagram of a brainstem. So this is pons and this part is the medulla. Okay, let me draw it here properly. Okay, this is medulla and this is the midbrain. So midbrain, pons, and medulla, and exactly on the posterior aspect of this is the fourth ventricle. So this is the location of fourth ventricle, just behind the brainstem. So this is the fourth ventricle and this is the cavity of the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle, it has a foramen called as the median foramen. We'll get to that later on. Now midbrain, it has two structures called as superior and inferior colliculi, and this structure is called as the superior medullary vellum. It is a thin sheet of white matter. So superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, and this is a thin sheet of white matter called as superior medullary vellum. Superior medullary vellum, and as we can understand, these structures contribute to the floor to the roof of fourth ventricle. Again, in the roof there is an aperture which is called as the median aperture, median foramen, or a special name is given to it called as foramen of Magendie. Foramen of Magendie. So through this foramen, the cavity of the fourth ventricle, it communicates with cisterna magna, which is part of subarachnoid space. So we will understand that in a separate diagram how it communicates. So let us first discuss the connections of the fourth ventricle. Okay, now as we can understand, this is floor and on the other side there is roof of the fourth ventricle. So again, if we draw the fourth ventricle, this is midbrain, pons, and medulla. So this is the floor of fourth ventricle and this is the roof of fourth ventricle. Here is the median aperture. So this is cavity of fourth ventricle, and superiorly it communicates through cerebral aqueduct. So at the level of midbrain, this continues as cerebral aqueduct, and through this the cavity of fourth ventricle communicates with the third ventricle. So superiorly it communicates with third ventricle through cerebral aqueduct, and inferiorly we have the central canal of spinal cord. So there is central canal of the spinal cord. This cavity of fourth ventricle continues with the central canal inferiorly. So this is how fourth ventricle is connected, and this is the cerebellum, lingula, and the last part is the nodule of the cerebellum. Okay, so this structure is the cerebellum, which is present just behind the fourth ventricle, and it is covered by the pia mater. So this green colored structure is the pia mater, and uh, outside pia mater there will be arachnoid matter, which will not cover the structures as firmly. So there will be some gap which is called as subarachnoid space. So this is pia mater and this is arachnoid matter. Now this gap between these two is called as subarachnoid space, and at certain places this gap is somewhat enlarged, and that's called as the cistern. This particular cistern is called as cisterna magna, also called as cerebellomedullary cistern, because it's located between these structures. So as we can understand, fourth ventricle communicates with cisterna magna through this foramen called as foramen of Magendie or median aperture. Fourth ventricle also communicates with cisterna magna through two other foramen which are present laterally. So since they are present laterally, they will not be visible in this diagram. These are called as lateral foramen or foramen of Lasca. So through foramen of Lasca and foramen of Magendie, the fourth ventricle communicates with cisterna magna or cerebellomedullary cister. So this was all about the connections of the fourth ventricle. Now let us discuss other parameters of fourth ventricle such as boundaries, floor and roof. Okay, so let us again start with our basic diagram of the brainstem which shows the location of fourth ventricle. So as we can understand, this is brainstem, pons, medulla, and this is the fourth ventricle. Behind fourth ventricle is the cerebellum. Now if we take a look from behind the fourth ventricle, from behind the brainstem, if we remove the cerebellum and then take a look from this angle, that means from the standing from posterior to the brainstem, so these are two colliculi, that means two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi of the midbrain. These structures below it, they are called as superior cerebellar peduncles. So these structures are superior cerebellar peduncles, and below these structures we have two inferior cerebellar peduncles which meet and form the inferior angle of the fourth ventricle. And at the inferior angle there are two tubercles present. These are known as the gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle. Now let's label these parts. So this is superior colliculus of the midbrain. Below it is inferior colliculus of the midbrain. In this left diagram, we are able to see only superior and inferior colliculi of one side. Okay. Now this is superior cerebellar peduncle, and below it is inferior cerebellar peduncle. Superior and inferior cerebellar peduncles. These two tubercles, the medial one is called as the gracile tubercle and the lateral one is called as the cuneate tubercle. These two tubercles are called gracile and the cuneate tubercles. Now let us start our main discussion with the angles of the fourth ventricle. So there are four angles as it's rhomboid shaped. So there is a superior angle, an inferior angle and two lateral angles. So in total there are four angles of the fourth ventricle. Now the boundaries of fourth ventricle, as we can understand from the diagram clearly, there are four boundaries in total. Two boundaries are spirolateral and two are inferolateral. So spirolateral boundaries are formed of superior cerebellar peduncles. Superior cerebellar peduncles form the spirolateral boundaries, and inferolateral boundaries are formed by inferior cerebellar peduncle, and these two tubercles, that means gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle. So inferolateral boundary is formed by inferior cerebellar peduncle, gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle. So these were boundaries of the fourth ventricle. Two spirolateral boundaries and two inferolateral boundaries. Now let us try to understand the floor of fourth ventricle. That means we are again taking a look at fourth ventricle from the posterior aspect but after removing the roof. Okay, so as we can understand from this diagram, this is the floor of fourth ventricle. It's formed by posterior part of pons and medulla. So we take a look from this angle but after removing the roof. Okay, so where what will we be able to see? So this is the superior colliculus, below it is the inferior colliculus. There are two superior colliculi, two inferior colliculi. Then again let me draw boundaries. So this is the superior cerebellar peduncle and below it is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and two inferior cerebellar peduncles, they meet at the inferior angle of the fourth ventricle, and at the inferior angle there are two tubercles called as gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle. Quickly let us label these parts. Okay, so this upper part, these are the two colliculi. This is superior colliculus, below it is inferior colliculus, This is superior cerebellar peduncle. The lower one is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is gracile tubercle, and the lateral one is the cuneate tubercle. So the structure in between these is the floor of the fourth ventricle. So we have removed the roof and now we are seeing the floor. It is rhomboid in shape, and it is like a fossa, because of which this floor is also called as rhomboid fossa. Floor is called as rhomboid fossa. Okay. Now, if we take a look at the floor, we see that there is a sulcus exactly in the middle, which divides this floor into two parts, the left and the right part. Okay, this sulcus, this is called as the median sulcus. This is called as median sulcus. So median sulcus divides floor into two parts. Now both these parts, they are further divided into two parts by another sulcus. So there are two sulci, one in each of these parts, which divides each of these parts into two different parts, one medial and other lateral. This sulcus is called as sulcus limitans. This sulcus is called as sulcus limitans, and the two parts, one of which is medial and the other is lateral, these parts are called as, okay, the medial part, it is called as the medial eminence. Medial eminence. This is the medial eminence, and the lateral part is called as the vestibular area. The lateral part is called as the vestibular area. So this is the vestibular area. So we have median sulcus, then we have sulcus limitans, and two areas, medial eminence and vestibular area. Now in the medial eminence, in the upper part of medial eminence, there is a bulge or an outgrowth which is called as the facial colliculus. This outgrowth is called as the facial colliculus. So what is this outgrowth and what is facial colliculus? If we recall from the section of cranial nerves, so let us take a look at the section of pons at the level of facial colliculus. So let me draw it here. This is section of pons, and at this level of pons, this is called as the section of pons at the level of facial colliculus. Two nuclei are seen. One is called as the abducent nucleus. So the blue one is the abducent nucleus and red one is the facial nucleus. Abducent nucleus and facial nucleus. The fibers of the facial nerve which emerge from facial nucleus, they go around the abducent nucleus and then emerge out of the brainstem, forming the facial nerve. So this via these fibers, they round around the abducent nucleus. This is called as facial colliculus, and this results in formation of this bulge in the on the posterior surface of pons, which is seen here in the floor of fourth ventricle as facial colliculus. In the upper part, the sulcus limitans divides into two sulci, and a depression is formed at this point, which is called as superior fovea. So obviously there should be another inferior fovea present in the lower part. Okay, superior fovea is found where this sulcus divides, and in relation to superior fovea, an area is present which is bluish in color. This is called as locus ceruleus. Locus ceruleus. This area contains, deep to this area, ceruleus nucleus is present, and the bluish color is because of melanin. And we can remember that in this area, norepinephrine synthesis takes place. So this area is called as locus ceruleus in relation to upper part of sulcus limitans. In the lower part, sulcus limitans, it gives rise to a sulcus which results in formation of two triangles. Okay, so before that, there is a thin fold of white matter which is in the almost central part, which is called as stria medullaris. This is called as stria medullaris, and just below stria medullaris, sulcus limitans gives rise to another sulcus which goes medially and results in formation of two triangular structures. So two triangular structures are formed. One is the upper triangle and this triangle, and another is the lower triangle. So upper triangle is called as the hypoglossal triangle. So upper triangle is called as hypoglossal triangle, And the significance of this triangle is that it contains hypoglossal nucleus, from which hypoglossal nerve arises. And the lower triangle, this triangle is called as the vagal triangle. This triangle is called as the vagal triangle. Now, in the lower part, this small area, it's called as area postrema. This area is called as area postrema, just above these tubercles, and the significance of this area is that vomiting center is located in this area, that's area postrema. Now there is another sheet of white matter here which covers the lower part of this floor. This sheet of white matter is called as tinea. This sheet of white matter is called as tinea. It covers the inferior angle and lower part of the inferolateral boundaries. It's called as tinea, and near the inferior angle it forms a tip-like structure, a nib-like structure, which is called as obex. Okay, so tinea, it forms obex near the inferior angle of the floor of fourth ventricle. So these were various structures associated with the floor of fourth ventricle: facial colliculus, locus ceruleus, sulcus limitans, and other structures. So this is all about the floor of the fourth ventricle. Now let us try to understand the roof of the fourth ventricle. So as we can understand, now again we are taking a look at this fourth ventricle from behind the brainstem, but this time we are not removing the structures of the roof. Okay, we are going to draw we are just removing cerebellum, and we are going to draw everything that we see. So the structures that we are going to see, these are this superior colliculus, superior medullary velum, in the lower part pia mater, and this cistern, etc. Okay, now let us discuss it in detail. So this is the superior, these are superior and inferior colliculi. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle, and below it is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So now we are discussing roof of the fourth ventricle. Okay, so in the upper part, in the upper half, the structures that we find in the roof, these are inferior colliculus, two cerebellar peduncles, and the two superior cerebellar peduncles, they are joined by a thin sheet of white matter. So this is inferior colliculus, this is superior cerebellar peduncle, and two superior cerebellar peduncles, they are joined by a thin sheet of white matter, which is called as the, so this is thin sheet of white matter. This is called as the superior medullary velum. It is nothing but a thin lamina or thin sheet of white matter. So these structures, they form roof in the upper part of the fourth ventricle. Inferior colliculus, superior cerebellar peduncle, and superior medullary velum, they form roof in the upper part. Now in the lower part, again if we take a look at this diagram, as you can see, in the lower part we have the ependyma lining the pia mater, which is green in color, the choroid plexus, which is present in the Tela Choroidae. Here, this is the choroid plexus. So now we are going to draw it here when we take a look at it from a different angle. So this is the ependyma lining, and this is the foramen, which is the foramen of Magendie, or the median aperture, and these are two foramen of Lashka, and through these, this fourth ventricle communicates with the cisterna magna. These are the lateral apertures, and the lower one is the median aperture or foramen of Magendie. Okay, now inside this there is also the lining of pia mater, which forms Tela Choroidae, and choroid plexus is present in this part. So let me draw choroid plexus here. So this is the choroid plexus. It is somewhat T-shaped, and these two arms, they meet near the median aperture. So this blue color is ependyma lining. Here this is the Tela Choroidae, and inside it is the choroid plexus. This choroid plexus is, this is the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, which is formed by the branches of posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This is the Tela Choroidae of the fourth ventricle. Now, so these are structures which are present in the roof. So in the lower part, we have Tela Choroidae and the choroid plexus formed by posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now, if we take a section of this roof, section of fourth ventricle at the level of upper part of pons, what we are able to see is two superior colliculi, two superior cerebellar peduncles, and there is stria medullaris which joins. So this level it passes through this upper part of pons. So there are two superior cerebellar peduncles and a superior medullary vellum, and the base is formed or floor is formed by upper part of pons, and inner to it there is ependyma lining. So this is ependyma lining. So these are structures. So this is the section at this level. Okay, this is lingula because lingula is also present in relation to roof of fourth ventricle, part of cerebellum. Okay. Now another section from, if we take another section at the level of lower part of pons, it's going to pass at this level, okay, at the level of Tela Choroidae. So if we take a look from this diagram, from a section at lower part of pons is going to pass through Tela Choroidae and choroid plexus, as we can see. So if we draw this section, we are going to see there are two inferior cerebellar peduncles. So these are two inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, in the first one there were superior cerebellar peduncles, and the base is found by the lower part of pons, and inside there is ependyma lining, and on the side of roof there is presence of Tela choroidae and choroid plexus. That means ependyma lining will come in contact with the pia mater. So this is pia mater, and together they will form Tela choroidae, which contains choroid plexus. So these are two limbs of the choroid plexus, and above it there is the pia mater which lines the cerebellum, okay, the lingula of cerebellum. So this is the section passing through lower part of pons. Now another section, if we take another section at the level of median aperture, at the level of foramen of Magendie, it will pass through medulla. Okay, so in this section again we have two inferior cerebellar peduncles. So these are inferior cerebellar peduncles. The floor in this case is formed by medulla oblongata. So floor is formed by medulla, and then there is lining of ependyma. However, on the roof side of on the upper side, this will be open, forming foramen of Magendie, and there will be lining of pia mater and arachnoid mater, and this part will be cisterna magna. So the cavity of fourth ventricle is going to communicate with cisterna magna through this foramen, that's foramen of Magendie. So these were different levels, the sections through different levels of this fourth ventricle, roof of the fourth ventricle. Now let us try to understand the recesses of fourth ventricle. So if we draw the diagram of the fourth ventricle along with recesses, so in between there is cavity of fourth ventricle and the others are the recesses. So in total there are 5 recesses. So this recess is called as the lateral recess. So there are 2 lateral recesses, and this is called as the dorsolateral recess. 2 lateral recesses, 2 dorsolateral recesses, and this one is called as the dorsomedian recess. So there are 5 recesses in total. In this diagram here, this is the dorsomedial recess. So that was all about fourth ventricle. I hope you liked the video.